There is a category of man that the martial arts world produces in reliable quantities across every generation. He is not a fraud in the simple sense of the word. He has trained, he has put in hours on real floors under real instruction and accumulated genuine technique along the way. He can demonstrate things that impress people who do not know enough to look closely, but somewhere in the accumulation of those hours, something goes sideways in the accounting. The hours become a story. The story becomes a legend. The legend becomes the operating identity of the man telling it, and once a legend becomes someone's operating identity, the legend requires constant maintenance, and the maintenance requires an audience, and the audience requires a performance, and the performance eventually requires a stage large enough to justify the scale of the claim. Frank Dux had been building his stage for the better part of a decade by the spring of 1988. Snorts. He had told the story of the Kumite to anyone in Los Angeles who would sit still long enough to hear it. He had described the underground full-contact tournament held somewhere in Asia. The tournament with no rules and no referees and no formal record that any journalist or investigator had ever been able to locate. The tournament he claimed to have won in 1975 while serving as a covert operative for the United States government. He had described the fights in specific and cinematic detail. He had described opponents he had defeated and techniques he had used and injuries he had sustained and overcome. He had produced records that investigators subsequently questioned and medical documents that reporters subsequently disputed and a personal history that collapsed in several of its most important particulars under the weight of basic fact-checking. None of that had slowed him down appreciably because the story was good, and Frank Dux, whatever else he was, understood that a good story told with sufficient conviction and sufficient physical presence behind it could carry a man a long way in a city that was professionally organized around the production of good stories told with sufficient conviction. He had parlayed the Kumite narrative into a consulting credit on Bloodsport, the 1988 Jean-Claude Van Damme film that dramatized a version of the tournament he claimed to have won. The film was in post-production that spring. Hogan was the fourth. His name was attached to it in a way that would soon be visible to anyone who sat through the closing credits. He was about to become, in a specific and limited but nonetheless real sense, famous. And famous, for Frank Dux, meant that the stage had finally caught up to the scale of the performance he had been rehearsing for years. What he had not accounted for was Chuck Norris. The evening in question was a Friday in late March of 1988. A private martial arts gathering at a training facility in Glendale, California, owned and operated by a retired tournament fighter named Arthur Kavanaugh, who had competed in the 1970s circuit and had maintained relationships across the Los Angeles martial arts community for 20 years since. Kavanaugh ran these evenings 4 or 5 times a year. They were invitation-only affairs that drew between 15 and 20 practitioners from different disciplines, different backgrounds, different levels of public profile, united by the common quality of being people Kavanaugh trusted to show up and train seriously and leave the ego at the parking lot. Snorts. He had been running them long enough that the evenings had developed a specific culture, which was the culture of a room where everyone present understood that the person next to them had been tested in some meaningful way, and that the appropriate response to that understanding was to listen before you talked, and to ask before you assumed, and to remember that the most dangerous person in any room was almost never the loudest one. Frank Dux had been invited through a second-hand connection. Hogan was the fourth a stunt coordinator who had worked on Bloodsport, had mentioned his name to Kavanaugh as someone who moved well and had interesting things to say about full-contact fighting. Kavanaugh had extended the invitation because his policy was to give people the benefit of the doubt until the room had a chance to form its own opinion. Chuck Norris had been coming to Kavanaugh's evenings for 3 years. He came because Kavanaugh was a serious man who kept serious company, and because Chuck's approach to martial arts had always been the approach of a man who believed that the practice had no terminal point, and that there was always something useful to be learned from watching different people solve the same fundamental problems with different tools. Chuck arrived at 7:15. He drove himself alone, in the same unremarkable way he did most things. He wore dark training pants and a plain navy t-shirt and the white running shoes he trained in. He was 47 years old that spring. His competitive career was long behind him. The film career was ongoing. Walker Texas Ranger was still several years in the future, but Missing in Action and Code of Silence and the Delta Force had established him as a reliable presence in a specific corner of the action market, and his name carried the particular weight that a name carries when it has been associated with genuine physical skill for long enough that even people who have never seen him compete take the skill for granted as part of the package. He shook hands with Kavanaugh at the door. He said hello to the people he recognized. He found a spot along the wall near the heavy bags and began moving through a warm-up routine with the quiet self-sufficiency of a man who has been preparing his body for physical work for 30 years and no longer needs anyone else in the room to be doing the same thing in order to proceed. Clears throat. Frank Dux arrived at 7:30 with a training partner, a younger man named Carver who had worked with him on the Bloodsport production, and who moved with the specific deference of someone who had been in the orbit of a larger personality long enough to have adopted the role of audience by default. Dux was 32 years old, 5'11", athletic in the way that men are athletic when they have trained consistently, but not in the way that men are athletic when they have competed at the level they claim. He carried himself with an expansiveness that filled the room in a way that trained practitioners generally do not fill rooms, because trained practitioners have generally learned through experience that the room does not need to be informed of your presence, and that announcing yourself loudly is usually the behavior of someone who is not certain enough of their own ability to let the ability do the announcing. Several people looked up when he came in. Several people exchanged the brief, calibrated glances that people exchange in a room with an established culture when someone arrives who does not yet understand what the culture requires. Kavanaugh greeted him at the door. He introduced him around. Dux shook hands and made eye contact and said the right things with the polished ease of a man who had been performing his own introduction for long enough that the performance had become indistinguishable from the genuine article. Snorts. He saw Chuck across the room. Something shifted in his energy, not obviously. Not in a way that most of the people present would have caught. But Kavanaugh caught it, and Raymond Hicks, a 54-year-old Shotokan instructor who had been coming to these evenings for 2 years, caught it, and Chuck himself caught it, because Chuck had spent his adult life learning to read the room before the room announced what it intended, and what he read in the 30 seconds after Frank Dux walked through the door was that the evening had acquired a variable that Kavanaugh had not planned for. The first hour was what these evenings always were in their first hour, which was the gradual, informal unwinding of different people doing different things in a well-equipped space, pad work in pairs, individual bag work, small technical conversations between practitioners from different disciplines. The relaxed but concentrated atmosphere of serious people who have set aside a Friday evening because they believe the practice is worth setting a Friday evening aside for. Dux worked with Carver on the near mat. He moved well. His striking combinations had the fluency of genuine practice, and his footwork was better than it appeared at first glance. The senior practitioners in the room watched him with the attentive neutrality they brought to watching anyone new, which was neither the generosity of assuming competence nor the suspicion of assuming its absence, but the honest empirical process of gathering data and reserving judgment until the data warranted a conclusion. Snorts Chuck watched him from the heavy bags. He watched him the way he watched everyone in a training environment, which was with a quiet, total attention that gave nothing away and collected everything. 40 minutes in, the session moved into its middle phase. Kavanaugh called a water break, and people gathered in loose clusters near the supply table along the east wall. Conversations started. The specific conversations that happen in rooms full of martial artists during water breaks, which are the conversations about technique and training methodology, and the endless interesting question of what actually works when the situation is genuine and the person across from you is genuinely trying to stop you. Dux had moved into a group of 4 people that included Raymond Hicks and 2 stunt performers and was talking about the kumite. He was telling a version of the kumite story calibrated for this audience, leaning on the technical details rather than the dramatic ones because he understood that this room required a different approach than a TV interview or a film set conversation. He was good at calibrating. That was one of the things he was genuinely skilled at. The story was landing reasonably well. Hicks was listening with the careful neutrality of a man who had not yet made up his mind. The stunt performers were listening with the slightly more engaged attention of people who work in a world adjacent to the martial arts and find the mythology of it interesting regardless of its accuracy. Clears throat. Then Chuck walked over. Not because he had been following the conversation from across the room. He walked over because he wanted water, and the water was on the table next to where the group was standing, and he poured himself a cup from the jug and stood at the edge of the group and drank it. Dux saw him come over. The calibration adjusted. The story acquired a new audience member, and the new audience member was the most significant one in the building, and Dux, who understood audiences the way performing men understand audiences, felt the gravity of that shift and moved toward it rather than away from it. He addressed Chuck directly. He said that he had always had respect for what Chuck had accomplished in tournament competition. Snorts, he said it with the particular intonation that signals a qualification is coming. He said that tournament karate, even at its highest level, was a structured environment with referees and rules, and the fundamental safety net of knowing that the opponent was operating inside the same constraints. He said that what he had experienced in the kumite was something categorically different. He said that the men he had fought in that tournament had been fighting for survival in the most literal available sense, and that the techniques required in that environment were techniques that tournament competition did not develop and could not develop because the environment was too controlled to produce them. He said all of this looking at Chuck with the direct, confident gaze of a man making a case he believed in. Chuck listened. He drank his water. His expression did not change. Then Dux said the thing. He said that he meant no disrespect by it. He always said that first, the men who are about to say disrespectful things. He said that his experience in the kumite had led him to a conclusion about the gap between tournament-trained fighters and genuinely battle-tested fighters, and that the conclusion was that the gap was larger than most people in the martial arts community were willing to acknowledge. He said that the techniques he had developed for the kumite would be decisive against any tournament-based system in a genuine encounter. And then he looked at Chuck Norris, 6-time world champion, the man who had been competing in full-contact karate since Frank Dux was in elementary school, and he said that he would defeat him in 30 seconds. Snorts, he said it, the way certain men say things that they have been rehearsing in their own imagination for long enough that the rehearsal has come to feel like experience. He said it with a smile. He said it in a room of 15 people who all understood exactly what had been said. Raymond Hicks set his water cup down on the table behind him. He set it down with the slow deliberateness of a man who wants his hands free. The two stunt performers took a simultaneous half-step backward, in the wordless coordinated way that people move when a space needs to be cleared for something that is about to require space. Kavanaugh, who had been talking to someone near the door, looked up with the expression of a host who has just detected that his evening has developed a complication. Carver, Dux's training partner, stood very still near the mat, with the expression of someone who had heard this kind of thing from this particular man before, and understood what it tended to produce. Chuck finished his water. He crumpled the paper cup once in his right hand and placed it on the table behind him. He looked at Frank Dux. The look lasted approximately 4 seconds and contained no readable emotion of any kind. Then he said that 30 seconds was plenty of time. He said it the way he said most things, which was without particular emphasis and without any of the vocal architecture that men use when they want what they are saying to sound more significant than the words themselves. He simply said it, as a statement of fact about duration. Then he walked to the center mat. Clear's throat. Dux followed. He pulled off the training top he was wearing and handed it to Carver. Underneath he wore a compression shirt and his build was visible, and it was the build of someone who had trained seriously. He rolled his neck. He settled into a stance that combined elements of several systems in the particular way that men settle into stances, when they have studied multiple disciplines and constructed a personal synthesis from the pieces. His hands were up, his weight forward on the lead foot, his eyes on Chuck with the bright focused attention of a man who had told this story for 10 years and had now arrived at the moment of its proof. Snorts. Chuck stood at the other end of the mat in his navy t-shirt and his dark training pants and his white running shoes. His hands hung at his sides. His weight was even on both feet. He did not take a stance. He did not roll his neck or bounce on the balls of his feet or perform any of the preparatory gestures that signal to a room that something athletic is about to begin. He simply stood there with his eyes on Dux and the open, patient quality of attention that he brought to anything that required him to see what was actually in front of him rather than what he had decided was going to be in front of him. Kavanaugh said, "Go." Dux moved first. He came forward with a lead hand jab followed immediately by a cross. A combination thrown with genuine speed and genuine commitment, not the telegraphed, theatrical movement of a man performing for an audience, but a real combination thrown by a man who had thrown it many times before and understood its mechanics. The jab did not connect. Chuck had moved his head 4 inches to the left, a rotation of the shoulders so minimal that 2 people watching from the side of the mat later said they had not seen it happen, only seen the jab arrive where Chuck's head had been a fraction of a second before it got there. The cross followed immediately and Chuck was no longer where the cross expected him to be. He had pivoted on his lead foot, the same compact 45-degree rotation that removed his centerline from the path of the incoming strike without requiring him to move his feet significantly or create any of the large visible defensive movements that untrained observers associate with effective defense. Snorts. His right hand came up inside Dux's extended punching arm, and he threw a short palm strike to Dux's sternum, calibrated. Not full power. The power of a strike intended to communicate rather than to damage. The communication was immediate and specific. It said, "I was inside your combination before the combination finished." It said, "The space you believed you controlled was never yours." Dux reset. His face had changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone at the back of the room would have read clearly, but the people standing close to the mat, Hicks and the stunt performers in Kavanaugh, who had moved to the edge of the space, could see it. The expression of a man whose first real data point had not matched his model. He circled. He threw a front kick with the lead leg. The kind of probing kick that martial artists use to test distance and create openings, thrown with the speed of a man who has drilled it repeatedly and knows its mechanics thoroughly. Chuck checked it with his shin, a clean economical block that redirected the kick's energy without absorbing it, and in the same motion stepped offline and threw a side kick to Dux's lead thigh. Snorts, short, fast, measured. The kick that said what Chuck's kicks always said in these moments, which was that the distance between us is mine to manage, and you do not have access to it without my permission. Dux felt it land. The information in the landing was the information that real contact always carries, which is the information that the man across from you is faster than your nervous system had estimated, when your nervous system was doing its estimating from a distance of 12 feet, with no actual exchange to calibrate against. He committed. It was the thing that men do when the technical approach has produced two data points that do not support the model and the body defaults to its most basic available logic, which is mass and forward pressure and the hope that sheer physical engagement at close range will produce a different result than technical engagement at distance had produced. He drove forward with his weight behind him and his arms reaching for any purchase he could establish. Chuck read the commitment a full second before it reached him. He dropped his weight onto his rear foot and his hips rotated and his right heel came around in the horizontal arc that traveled from the blind side, the side that disappears from a man's peripheral vision when his head drops and his eyes point at the floor during a forward drive. The bande dalyo chegi, the spinning back heel kick, the technique that had closed tournament finals for Chuck Norris when Frank Dux was still learning to tie his own belt. Snorts, the heel traveled its arc and arrived at Dux's left temple and stopped, 1 inch short. Chuck held it in the air for the half second required to make the point visible to everyone in the room. Then he lowered his foot. Then he stepped back. That was the first part of what happened. The second part happened because Dux did not stop. He had felt the kick stop beside his head, and he had processed the geometry of it, understood somewhere in his nervous system that the kick had arrived from an angle he had not tracked and at a speed he had not anticipated, and the processing had taken approximately 1 second, and in that 1 second something had occurred in him that the people watching from the edge of the mat would describe afterward in various ways, all pointing at the same essential observation, which was that he did not accept the conclusion the kick had offered. He came forward again. He threw a wild overhand right, the kind of punch that technique produces when technique has been rattled and the body is substituting urgency for precision. Chuck slipped it by rotating his shoulders. He planted his lead foot. He threw a lead leg roundhouse kick to Dux's midsection, this one not calibrated, not a measuring strike, a real kick thrown at a level of power sufficient to deliver an unambiguous answer to a question that had now been asked twice. Clear's throat. The kick landed on Dux's left side, below the ribs, at the precise location where a kick of that speed, and from a man of that technical development lands when it is thrown without the margin that courtesy usually builds into it. Dux went down, not dramatically, not in the way that film fights render people going down, which involves extended airtime and theatrical impact sounds. He went down the way people go down when a real strike lands in a real location, which is by losing the structural organization that keeps a body vertical and finding the floor by the most immediate available path. He was on the mat on one knee with his right hand touching the rubber surface for balance and his left arm across his midsection where the kick had landed. Bloodsport was released in the United States in February of 1988. It earned over $11 million at the domestic box office against a budget of approximately $2.5 million. Frank Dux's consulting credit appeared in the closing titles. His version of his own history continued to be disputed by journalists and military records, researchers for the following 3 decades, and Frank Dux continued to dispute the disputing with the practiced resilience of a man who had built his identity on a story, and understood that the story and the identity were now the same thing, and that surrendering one meant surrendering both. Chuck Norris never spoke about the evening at Kavanaugh's gym. He had a principle about encounters that were finished, which was that the encounter had said what it had to say while it was happening, and that saying more about it afterward was a way of diminishing rather than honoring what it contained. He kept the principle, he kept it for the rest of his life. The people who had been in that gym on a Friday evening in late March of 1988 kept the story. They told it in the specific way that people tell stories they actually witnessed, which is carefully and without embellishment, and with a recurring emphasis on the particular detail that made it real for them. For Hicks, it was the palm strike inside the combination, the economy of it, the way it arrived before the combination had finished. For the stunt performers, it was the spinning kick stopping 1 inch from the temple and the foot held in the air for the half-second required to make it legible. For Kavanaugh, it was the 26 seconds, the fact that the number named had been met and then bettered by 4 full seconds, as though the margin itself was a courtesy extended to the man who had named it. There are men who spend their lives inside the discipline and arrive through that long practice at a genuine knowledge of what they are and what they are not and what the mat will and will not confirm about them. And there are men who spend their lives constructing a story about themselves and defending the story against the evidence and finding stages large enough to keep the story credible for the audiences they require. The difference between those two kinds of men is not always visible from a distance. In a well-equipped private gym in Glendale on a Friday evening in the spring of 1988, with 15 people watching and a rubber mat underfoot and 26 seconds on the clock. The difference was visible in the most complete and specific way that the difference is ever made visible, which is by removing every possible variable except the two men and the mat, and the time it takes for the truth to arrive.